Hi, everybody. Okay, this is an amazing team that almost needs no introduction. Jordan Robertson with Bloomberg Business Week and Latanya Sweeney, Professor Sweeney from Harvard, have been working to begin the first stage of what we announced last year. We need a data map. Where does health data go? Nobody has a chain of custody for their health information. Nobody. We don't know where it is. And so we've had a few technical glitches. So I'm just going to let them start and ask lots of questions. And congratulations and thank you for getting this work up. And I have to tell you, Jordan's story is already on Bloomberg today. So you can read about this already. Thank you.
Thank you. Come on. It's really great to be here. This is probably going to be the first time you've seen two people literally make a presentation together, but I think it's so fitting because it's really how we worked. Yeah. It was just a fantastic project. So as Deb and others pointed out, and those of you who were here last year, I see many familiar faces, so it's good. We wanted to figure a way to make data sharing more transparent, and so we launched an idea called the DataMap. And the idea was to use crowdsourcing, and we had this whole thing all figured out. The only problem is we needed some seed money to do it, and that seed money didn't come through. But we weren't going to be undone. Jordan and I had a great conversation a year ago today.
A year ago today.
A year ago today, and it started. And so we want to show you what we've done over the last year to extend the data map. Many of you may, next slide. Okay, so many of you may remember this was a data map that just showed where a typical but hypothetical patient named Alice's health record, all the places it would go. And this was done in 1997, right at the time of the HIPAA debate by a committee of the National Research Council. Next slide. Next slide. And then last year we showed this one. This is one that I did for 2010. And it showed how much more data sharing for that same kind of record would be today, what is today, well, at least as it was of 2010. But the question was, next slide. There's going to be a delay on that clicker. Click, click. Next slide. Oh, she's on the next slide. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm looking at my computer, which doesn't move. Sorry. So we said, let's just take one path and talk about that path. So this path is from Alice's data. She goes to the hospital, and at the hospital does what is called hospital discharge data. It's data that's usually mandated by the state to go primarily to a state or a state-appointed organization. Next slide, click rather. And so we already knew in the map that it already went to public health. Next, click. It went to researchers, click. And it went to companies that did outcomes analytics, click. But the question that Jordan and I began is, where are all the other places that this data might go, and how do we document it? How do we find it? What the risks might be? Next slide. Thank you. So we began. One of the pieces we did was we did a survey of all 50 states. We communicated with them. We went through all kinds of different ways to find out what do they do with this data. So it turns out that 33 states, the ones that you see in blue, are states that actually sell or give away data. Next slide. But one of the things that's interesting is most of those states, when they give away the data, they use a standard that's less than the HIPAA standard. So HIPAA is our federal standard. It requires dates be in years and geography be no less than 5-digit zip code and going up to 2-digit zip code if that area, if the population is less than 20,000 people. Next slide. So, and then if you want to know which state provides which kind of data, you can look on the data map. We have nice tables that give itemizations per state as to exactly what it is they release and how much it costs and things like that, and how you can get it. But one of our questions became, suppose you have this data, what does it look like? So this is an example, and what might be the risk to individuals. So this is an example of a record. And what you see here is these records typically include the name of the hospital, some admission information, when the discharge was done, the length of stay, how much it was cost, who paid for it, then diagnosis codes are emergency codes that tell us a lot more about what was going on with that patient. And then they'll usually have other demographics. In this particular case, age in years, age in months, gender, zip, the state of residency, and race and ethnicity. Now, this is a sample data set out of Washington State. So we chose, as our first example, Washington State. And the question was, if this is the kind of, and this particular data set costs $50 per year. And so this is, we got data for 2011. And the question was, could you re-identify anyone? Next slide. So one of the things we were interested in is, suppose you know that someone went to the hospital. So that's, you might know a friend or a family member who went to the hospital. You would know about what hospital they went, what the date of the admission to the hospital roughly would have been, and you know something about why they were there. That's also the same information that an employer would know about an employee taking hospital leave. It's also the same kind of information that a financial institution would know about someone who said that they needed they were going to be late making credit card payments because of a hospitalization. It's also the same kind of thing that a data mining company would know, could extract from purchasing pharmacy data. Another place that this kind of data comes is in news stories. So we went for the state of Washington and surveyed NexusLexis, which has only had 3 data sources. Clearly there are more than 3 news sources in the state of Washington. 3 news sources in the state of Washington. But we just used those 3 sources just to get us going. We pulled out 100 articles. Some of the articles were not a search on hospitalization. Some of the articles got ruled out because they were about hospitalization in neighboring states. And so that left us with 81 subjects. But you can see the kind of information that appears in a news story is the person's age, some notion of where they're from. In this case, he's from Soap Lake, Washington. The person's name, what happened to him. In this story, he's in a motorcycle accident. And also down at the bottom, you can see when he went to the hospital and what hospital he went to. So the question is, how do we go about, could we take this kind of data from a news story, just the reports about motor vehicle accidents and any other reports we could see for hospitalization, and link it to some of the other data to put a name to those records? So we did so. Jordan will talk in just a moment, or he'll interrupt me at any point. So we do it in 2 steps. The first step we do is we take the age and residence and name information, and we just go to online public record sites. And what they'll tell us is contact information like phone numbers and addresses. They'll also tell us zip codes that are associated with that person. Then in the second step, we take the zip code and, thank you. Habit. We take the zip code and the other information that appeared in the news article, and we link it with the fields that appeared in the hospital data. And what that will do is allow us to take this data that didn't have name, associated name with it, along with characteristics about the person's care. So the question is, how unique would such a match be? So we had 81 subjects. And what we were interested in is not probabilistic matching, but exact matches. That is, I pulled the data out. If the hospital data is very compliant and very complete and seemingly highly accurate, so you basically have this golden register. I take the news stories, maybe not so always right, but let's assume it's accurate. And if it is accurate, I should be able to exactly match it to this data. And if that is a unique, if it matches to only 1 record, that should be the person's record. So there's no probabilistic anything here. It's pretty simple. That's exactly what we did. We found 35 exact matches, which is around 43%. Then I hired a temp. I called a temp agency and I asked for someone who knew how to use computers, but who had no mathematical, computer science, statistical, or medical background. And they sent me a really great person. Her name is Lauren Ogabi, and I showed her what we had done with these re-identifications, and I told her, I missed these cases. She had 5 cases. Then it grew to 10, but the question was, could she find them using whatever she could just find on the internet? And we hire her for 2 days to do that. And she did, and she matched every single one of them and was able to say why the computer failed. And almost always it was either it was usually a zip code was wrong, and she would find another zip code for the person. So this was pretty successful. So now the question is, what does it all mean? And so one of the things that Jordan did, which, please Jordan, talk, is how accurate did you find it? Because you also had a different way that you wanted to go about looking at this data.
Sure, yeah, well, just by way of introduction, again, I'm a reporter with Bloomberg News. My name's Jordan Robertson. Latanya and I connected over a year ago when I wanted to write about this chart right here. Well, you can't see it, but
oh, sorry, next slide.
The actual data map, this one. Latanya and I had talked a few times. I'd seen this chart, and I thought it was really interesting because we know so much about where other types of data move, where they go. So internet data, sales data, cell phone data. But as Deb was pointing out, medical data is this black box. We really don't know where it goes. So I wrote about this, and Latanya and I started talking, and a year ago today, we connected, and we started brainstorming ideas about, I want to start filling in this map. I mean, and where do we begin? How do we start doing that? And we came up with the idea. Latanya had the insight. She said, an area where we both can do some really powerful research together might be hospital discharge data. And the reasons are twofold. One is that, as she mentioned, and as we put out in our story today, state public health agencies are not bound by HIPAA explicitly, so they can release data in any form they want. Many comply with HIPAA safe harbor, many do not. And so it was that insight, it was that kernel of an idea that gave us the seed of the idea for this project. And so what we were thinking of doing is what Latanya's just described, which is trying to re-identify patients. That's kind of the jackpot. But also, because these are state agencies, that gives me a FOIA privilege. So I'm able to do public records requests with states to fill in these extra arrows to say, where are you selling this data? What are the big health data companies that are buying this information? And that was a very long process. I mean, these are long requests to submit, to get back. And we took literally every minute of the past year to get all this data collected and analyzed. And what we found was really interesting. I mean, it was actually fairly easy to fill in these other arrows to figure out where this data goes. So the report that we did was twofold. We showed where, who are the big buyers of this hospital discharge data, and most importantly, can we re-identify patients? Is this data being bought and sold in a way that puts some patients' identities at risk? And it really, really wasn't the last few weeks that we homed in, and we started identifying patients. And what I would do is Latanya would run her algorithms, she'd match the public records, and I would call patients. And as I had to tell folks that I would call, I say, I understand this is a strange call to get. I'm a reporter, I'm not selling you anything, but I have your medical record, or what I believe is your medical record. And I had to be very sensitive that, to tell them what we're doing is a story on medical privacy, but the trick here, which Latanya and I brainstormed early on, was if we use news stories to do some of the matching, it not only gives us a really nice data set to match against, but it also gives me a reason to make this call. So I can call folks and say, I'm calling about the accident, and I'm doing a story on medical privacy, and the majority of people understood what I was calling about, and I explained it to them, and we have a number of them quoted in the story. But so that was the second or third phase of this project, which was me going through the data and going over line by line with people I was able to reach either at home or through cell phones or whatever, and ensuring that we had the right matches. And it became almost comical at one point because, I mean, it was right on. I mean, these records were, these records included diagnoses and procedures, diagnoses mostly that many patients didn't even know they had. As we mentioned in the story, I mean, somebody who goes in for a broken arm from a car crash might show addiction to heroin or methamphetamines or cancer or all these other things that show up in a hospital intake, which is shown on these records. And there were some folks who said, I'll talk to you, but you can't use my name. I'll confirm the information, but there's some really sensitive stuff in there, such as drug addictions and other, health issues. And of course, we abided by that. It's been a tremendous project, not only because we can start to figure out where some of this data goes, but also showing that many of these states are releasing more data than even some of them realize. And by the time we got our hands on the data and we're actually able to re-identify patients, we've had our first major success with the project before it was even published, which is that Washington State said that they were going to tighten up their standards. So that was the state we looked at. As Latanya said, we got 35 patients out of 81 news stories. So, almost a 50% average for what is, a really small sample. And, we think the story is just, it's just terrific, and it's...
Okay, so Jordan glossed over a few things. Let's see if we can finesse it out, get it out of him. Some of it is because my computer, for whatever reason, we're having technical problems projecting it. So otherwise, we would show you online on the datamap.org who those top buyers are. Who are the top buyers across the multiple states from the FOIA, from the open records requests that he put in. And so you want to tell people?
Oh, sure.
Do you remember some of them?
Yeah, oh yeah, this was by far, the re-identifications were obviously very interesting, but also getting these FOIA requests back from the states, which weren't all that hard to get, were also very interesting as well, because they would list, taken in isolation, you can't really make much sense of them, but combined, what I did was I requested data from the 20 most populous states. Some of those states have their discharge databases run by private hospital associations, so they're under no obligation to give me the data. Of the 12 that did give me data, we were able to map them and to show which companies bought from every single state or from most states. And what became very apparent is that, whereas when HIPAA was created, typically the buyers of this data have been public health researchers, universities, academics, kind of the folks that you would expect that would be interested in studying health trends. That's flipped now. The biggest buyers of the data, and I really wish we could show it to you.
Oh, they're online. They got it online. Can you click on the list of top buyers? Thank you. Well, that's not right. Can you click on states? See where it says states on the left? Just click on states. Now click on buyers.
Great. Yeah, you'll notice some very interesting names on this list. These are not the public health researchers and universities that you might expect to buy this data. The interesting part about this is you'll see names like WebMD, you'll see Optum Insight, you'll see Ingenix, you'll see IMS Health, you'll see some of the biggest names in pharmaceutical data buying hospital data. And part of the story that we wrote looked at the fact that some of the biggest companies buying hospital data, which is disseminated for public health research primarily, is being used now to target pharmaceutical ads and to aid pharmaceutical companies in their marketing efforts. Nothing inherently wrong with that, but that's an interesting inversion of what the data was originally used for. We talked to a number of these companies. Of course, all of them say it's de-identified, we don't know patient names, but hospital records, I found out, are very useful in enriching prescription data databases, because a prescription record will only show you what medication you're on. If you can link that with a hospital record, you can also learn what your original diagnosis was, which physician recommended you that particular drug, as well as all these ancillary conditions. So it turns out, and I had no idea about this, but hospital discharge data is one of the most valuable pieces of data within this medical data ecosystem. But states, because there are laws on the books proscribing them from selling the data for more than anything than cost, states basically give away this data to multi-billion-dollar companies that make a lot of money off of it. And that's kind of the disconnect between what the data was originally intended for and what it's used for now. And that was a result of some of these spreadsheets we got back, and it's been very interesting to chart that. And that's...
And the other thing I was hoping you would comment a little bit on, about of the 35 that were exact matches and that you contacted, about 10 of them had what I would consider sensitive diagnoses,
right,
like venereal diseases, right, or drug dependency, alcohol dependency, things like that. So what happened when you called people that had those kinds of...
There were some interesting anecdotes that came out of the reporting. As I say, there was a public official that we mentioned in the story who was very open. I mean, he took a leave from his job, and he announced the illness, and he was very open about talking with me. He had a private condition on his record that when I went down the list, this was at the last one on the list, he said, "I'm happy to talk with you, I'm happy to participate, you can't mention the last condition, it's an older condition." I said, "Of course," and that's how we phrased it in the story. That was a pretty similar experience across most of the calls. However, there were also some folks who were very eager to participate, and they were upset that Washington sold their data in this way. and they would give their name and go on the record and do the whole thing, until I got to the point of asking them, well, is this also accurate? I'm also showing a heroin addiction, or I'm also showing methamphetamine addiction, or some of these very personal health issues. And I got some angry responses. I got some, some folks who most of the time were angry that I knew it. Not so much, they were angry that somebody knew about it, and understandably so, and I tried to be very sensitive with those folks. But those folks were understandably upset, and they were upset at the state, they were upset at the fact that this was possible, and they requested anonymity in the story for understandable reasons. So that was one of the most interesting aspects of this, because you can learn so much more from a hospital record than you initially thought. And the vast majority of these records, as Latanya pointed out, had other stuff in it that was cataloged upon hospital intake. But some of the patients didn't even know. One of the patients I talked to had a neurological disorder in his past. And he had no idea the hospital even knew that upon his intake. And then, of course, the fact that I knew it and that we were writing a story about it was equally unsettling to him. It just shows you how much data you can get from these records. And I was very surprised to learn that this is one of the most valuable health data sources around. And it's sold for virtually nothing. Some of these states, I think the grand total of the 12 states that gave us data was like 1.9 million for 2011. It's the latest year we had data. That's the grand total for how much they sold these databases for that year.
That's their income.
As their income. And my sense is that in most states, that doesn't even pay the cost of processing and actually administering these services. We have a stat in the story, though, where they say that uses of secondary health data is projected to be a $10 billion industry by 2020. So just to give you a sense of the widening gap between, the value of this data to states and the value of this data to private organizations. And again, that's not necessarily a judgment call, but it is a sign of how deeply valuable, especially this hospital data, is to private enterprise, and both for studying hospital costs and doing things that Obamacare mandates in terms of, lowering the cost of care and measuring outcomes and all of those things that I think most people would find, reasonable. There are a lot of other uses as well that, perhaps merit some further study. And there was one state in particular that was really interesting to me, and that was Pennsylvania. Most of the states I talked to, they said, we're capped at how much we can charge for the data. It's either $50 or $0 or like $100. Pennsylvania said, they've seen increased demand from commercial data companies, so they jacked the rates way up for those companies. It's like $33,000 a year for a data set for a commercial data company. And they made the most money by far from any company in our survey, $750,000 in 2011, which I thought was a very reasonable strategy to pursue. And they were very transparent about it. They said, we have so much demand from these companies that it makes sense that we recoup the cost and then some. And that kind of subsidizes what is traditional public health research. So I suspect that that's a model that, now that the story's out and kind of a lot of companies and states are probably looking at these numbers, might pursue in the future, because there's almost no reason for a state to give away the data to everybody if some companies are making a lot of money off of it. So it's likely we're going to see more of these 2 or 3 tiered systems emerge from this type of reporting.
Yeah. I have more questions I can ask of him to bring out some of the experiences, but we also are we'll open the floor to questions as well. I think you have to go to one of the mics if you want to ask a question. And while people are doing that, one of the things I want you to talk a little bit about is, in earlier work back in 1997, when I was a graduate student, I had done a re-identification like this that brought up the Weld example.
Right.
And in this study, we came up with lots of high-profile people because they're in the news, right? And so what happened when you contacted them?
Sure, yeah, no, it's a great point. One of the things that Latanya and I initially talked about when we first connected was we wanted to do a re-identification study. We didn't really know how to do it. And Latanya mentioned 97, when she found the medical records of the former Massachusetts governor, Bill Weld, in a redacted data set. That was really the catalyst for the HIPAA privacy rules that we have today. And so we were kind of brainstorming about whether we could recreate that in some way. And the example we came up with was this. But one thing we really wanted to emphasize in the story was that, she got a lot of, there was some criticism of that study, because here's a famous person. Of course, you already know a lot about a famous person. You can learn where they live, you can learn their age and whatnot. What we really wanted to show in this study was this could be everybody, as was the case with Weld, but that was a point that may have been missed. But, so what we really emphasized in this story, in this project, was this can be anybody. And the main person we chose to profile in the story was a guy named Ray Boylston, he lives in a tiny town called Soap Lake, Washington. He's a two-tour Vietnam vet. He rides a motorcycle on the weekend, and he crashed, and we got his medical record, and he was very upset about the fact that his data could be identified. He was a person who agreed to talk with us on the record. There were also some known names that were in these documents as well. The challenge of getting them to talk and to work with us was more challenging. But there was one person who talked with us who said, confirmed the data, and then also said, I'm getting off the phone. I got to talk to my lawyer to see if I can sue the state. And that was kind of the level of anger and outrage about, not what we were doing, but what the state had done with their hospital records. And that was very revealing, because when you get to more known names, you get to folks who do have lawyers, who do have public relations teams and can, muscle a lawsuit through. So I chose to stress in the story that this can be anybody. And most importantly, that it could be you. The first example I thought of when we started to do these re-identifications was this could be your employer. As Latanya mentioned, if you take leave and your employer lacks scruples, they could potentially, if you live in one of these states that sells data this way, look up what your conditions were, which for obvious reasons would be pretty troubling. But some other examples we thought of as well were private investigators, either investigating divorce cases or custody cases, or stock short sellers. This would be a gold mine in their hands, because they're always looking for information, private information about executives that they can use to manipulate stock. So we came up with a big list of who might have an interest in doing this in the private world, assuming they're not already doing it, which I don't know if I'd be willing to make that assumption. The data has a lot of value in the wrong hands, and we've chosen to publicize this because we're trying to draw attention to it. This could have been done just as easily by a private investigator, by a short seller, by an employer, if they had the wherewithal and the means to do it. And that's really the troubling part.
Okay, so let's take some questions.
Okay. Again, as a pediatric institution, we're very concerned about children's records. And so two things, I don't know, I haven't read your story, is did you take in consideration the health industry as a whole is immature in terms of its privacy controls and its technological information security controls, which kind of leads to this situation? So that's number one. Number two is the fact, because of this immaturity, one of our biggest concerns is medical ID theft, especially with children's records, because children's records are very clean and can be used for a long time until they turn 18, and then that's when they look at their credit history. Is that organized crime is starting to come into this area because the industry is so immature in terms of its controls. And for example, that Utah breach that hit that university was done probably from the Eastern European mob. So did your article explore that area, or are you going to explore that area?
Yeah, I'm happy to take it.
You want to go first? Or
Oh,
I would say, first of all, I push back a little bit on this idea of immaturity. So it may be immature by some standard, certainly by the standard that we think technical solutions can come to play in. So I'm a computer scientist, and so I look to how technology could solve this problem. But this is not a security problem. Nobody broke into this data, right? And also in the United States, the most sophisticated laws we have around privacy are health. We don't have anything, health and finances, that's it. And so this is our gold standard.
Yeah. And the only thing I'd add to that as well is it's an interesting question, because when we first started doing this research, one thing that was important for me to nail down was how state public health agencies came to have this exemption from HIPAA. I think it's generally assumed that any company or organization handling health data has to be compliant with HIPAA. As most folks in this room know, that's not the case. It's actually a very, very limited set of entities that have to comply with that. So in talking to some of the folks involved in HIPAA's drafting and some of the initial crafting of the law, I drilled in on this idea of how did states become exempt. And their response was, this was actually a push by consumer advocates, thinking that because of lobbying by pharmaceutical companies and insurance companies, that they believed had watered down HIPAA somewhat, they pushed for an exemption for state public health agencies, thinking that many states would enact stricter standards to protect uniquely vulnerable populations, like AIDS patients and concentrated areas of disease. That's happened in some cases. As we mentioned, some states have indeed enacted stricter than HIPAA privacy protections. As we've seen in Washington, they haven't. So there was this moment where, this, conversation never would have happened, but that's not the way it went. And this gold standard that Latanya talks about was definitely true in this. I mean, in talking to Washington State, what became very clear is, if they had complied with safe harbor, we wouldn't have been able to do this research. And many states don't do that. So there is a gold standard out there. It was a conscious decision to exclude the states, and the folks I've talked to said it's probably time to rethink whether that's an appropriate path.
She's been waiting a long
Sorry.
time.
It's okay. I'm actually standing here feeling a little naive. So I'm the commissioner of the Department of Mental Health and Addictions in Connecticut. And we're obviously subject to all the FOIA laws. I cannot imagine that we would sell any medical data. I just can't.
Let's pull up the chart again.
I really don't want to
I
know.
have to see if Connecticut is exempt or not.
We're a cabinet level department, though, and so I would be shocked if the Department of Public Health was selling it. No?
Just go backwards on the slides.
Okay.
Keep going. All the way. I think it's like the. Keep going. Keep going.
No, they passed it.
Oh, you passed it? Go forward. Go back.
I know.
Go back. Thank you.
I mean, we look like we are, but again, we're having a conversation here about who has the discharge data set, and it would be probably our Department of Social Services, which is our Medicaid agency.
We have an
I feel like I need to fly back tonight.
Well, no. We have an administrative, on the survey part of the website, we'll put up the administrative table. It'll tell you exactly who has it, what the URL is for it, and their address and name and so forth. So we'll put that on later on today. And also the paper about the experiment and the various components.
Great.
The article, and then the experiment is its own paper, which you can download now, and the survey is its own paper, which you'll be able to download this evening.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I was at Health Datapalooza the last 2 days, and there were lots of exhibitors who resell CMS data sets and try to make them more user-friendly for their big pharma and other clients. And I was asking how much more valuable their data might be if the people whose data were involved had given permission to get a touchback so that it was able for the researcher or the pharmaceutical company to send maybe an email back to the individual people as part of their study or their marketing. And I kept getting these really broad smiles and wondering, what does that mean? Because they were not really willing to clarify. And finally someone explained, well, that can already be done. And I said, huh? And they said, well, yeah, if you pair public information data sets, consumer data sets against the discharge records, just like you're describing, this is a match already being made by these companies, and they're already targeting advertising. They can't let the person know how they found out that they have disease X, maybe in that location. But I realized, although it's not publicly advertised, there must be consultants and companies in the background doing that. Were you able to find any of these companies that do the matching?
It's an important point to mention. I mean, of all the big companies that we talked to, that we mentioned there, I talked to all of them, went over their policies. It's hard to know with private companies. I mean, the key to this research here is that it involved public agencies, so we did have that FOIA privilege. With private companies, they're not under any obligation to tell me anything, so it's really hard to know what exactly they do. I don't have any evidence that any of the companies we mentioned are doing anything untoward with the data, but I will say this, is that the data has a lot of value, and what my experience has been covering Silicon Valley, and seeing technology companies overstep on privacy all the time, it makes sense to me that when there's a financial incentive, somebody's eventually going to step over the line. And we have a quote to that effect in the story. So, and there's also this disconnect between the idea of data being HIPAA de-identified, which every company on that list said, of course, it's all HIPAA de-identified. no problem. Between de-identified and being anonymous, and what was interesting in talking to some of these data companies is that the databases they compile, do suck up data from so many sources, hospitals, pharmacies, insurance companies, and whatnot, that the profiles they create are remarkably detailed. They don't have your name, and they may or may not have your age, but they do have your zip code. They do have all your diagnoses. They do have your procedures. So if they do want to target marketing to you, that's very easy. They can put up a billboard in your neighborhood. They can send you direct mail. And so there's this idea, they'll all say, we don't want your name. They don't need your name. It's like online marketing. I mean, they don't need your name. They don't want your name. They've got your cookie information. They can target marketing to you that way. So the richness of these data sets is really what gives them the ability to target marketing without even necessarily doing what we do here. I mean, this is the next step, but they have so much information to begin with that it's actually a small step, to get kind of to where we were here. So.
I have a question. I also was at the Datapalooza, and so I'm understanding that the privacy rule regarding business associates has to do with the fact of whether or not the data is de-identified. So therefore, then, if they are just using de-identified data, the HIPAA doesn't apply. And then I was particularly alarmed as I was talking to Athena Health and finding out that they have their cloud, and if a company leaves, that they're going to hold on to the data forever because it's in the cloud. So my question has to do then with what this privacy rule means in regards to business associates. Is it basically just this one big old loophole with regards to de-identified data, and does that have to change?
Could you go to the next slide for a second? So the 26 states that use less strict standards than the HIPAA safe harbor is an example of a known vulnerability. Suppose that all of them were to raise their standard to the HIPAA safe harbor. How might that thwart this? How might it make a difference? So that's still an open question, but we know we have that standard, and at least to get to there. And so in the terms of the business associate agreement, in general, if you are willing to sign a business associate agreement, you can get the identifiable stuff, you can get the sensitive stuff. So this idea of multiple tiers is understandable. Though it's not that you want all data sharing to stop. A lot of this data are used for really great, worthy purposes, and you don't want it to stop. But in some ways, what's kind of nice about the business associate agreement, on the one hand, is you're signing over that you're going to be held to the same criminal and civil penalties as the original covered entity under HIPAA. And what de-identification is used for in HIPAA is to free you from those civil and criminal liabilities. So if you can get it to the safe harbor standard, then you're free from the criminal and civil penalties. This kind of multiple tier idea is still a good idea, in the sense that it would be nice if the version that Washington State gives out was at least the same as restrictive as the HIPAA safe harbor. But if you needed more detail, they had another process that you had to go through, something more more blood you have to give to get the data.
Yeah, and it was really the public data sets that we're most interested in here, because as you mentioned, if you're a business associate, you can get all the data. You have to comply with HIPAA. There's a legal requirement, and there are legal penalties there. But these public data sets are bought and sold freely, sometimes given away, and these are things that we were able to download very easily at minimal cost, and that's kind of where we focused the research this time for that reason. Anybody can get it, whether you're a private investigator or a short seller or whatever, and that was kind of the main area of interest.
Bill Pugh is Marshall University. I've been a clinical researcher, and I also worked on high tech in the Senate when it came out. It's a great presentation. The re-identification is an issue, but you raised the issue also here about the public health exception, and I think that I'm actually very ashamed of most of my colleagues, because I was trained in an era where the idea of consent was essential, and I think what we've gone to now is an expediency that wants to shortcut consent. In the exception, and I'm open to correction for anyone on that, the perspective we got in the rewriting or the High-Tech Act was not the original intent you described, but has become solidified now that if you're not in favor of the public health exception, you must not be in favor of improving public health, and this is all for the good, and it can't be used to the bad. The problem here, though, is that that's not de-identified data. They can take PHI. They're actually, under the new HITECH Act and under the new rule, able to purchase that from a covered entity at a profit. The profit exemption's gone. So given where the state finances are, I'm over in West Virginia now, and I know our state's probably going to be under the same pressure as everywhere else, to take public health data from covered entities that sell it to them at a profit, resell that to whomever, wherever, without consent, and this is not de-identified data anymore. That's a loophole that it's very hard to get people to understand the aspect of that, and we were trying to block that at the time HITECH came out, and it really has become messaged publicly that this is all good. Investigators, clinicians are going to use this rather than some of the folks that you've described, so very helpful.
I'm really glad you brought up HITECH. I know Bill Yasnoff is here. I'm sure it came to his mind right away was how this would fit in with HITECH. It's actually, if you read the paper about the experiment part, the re-identification, that's actually the motivation for the work, is because in a year from now, when these, so under HITECH, the same kind of data times 10 will be available on everyone. So the fact right now it just says the code says that this guy had a drug dependency, but after HITECH, that record would basically say, and here's the value, the lab value that supports that, or here's the information from the labs or the measurements that support that, and that information goes into a repository for sharing. Now, that won't be these same repositories, it'll be different repositories. And that's actually alarming too. It's something that Jordan and I talked a lot about, because what made this transparent was that he could go and issue a FOIA request. But under HITECH, these are all private, public cooperations. Yeah. Not able to issue, you won't know, you won't be able to say, where did all the places you sold the data?
What you've just done provided some evidence for a rule that I've tried to, or an instruction, the guidance that HHS put out that I've tried to get people's attention to, and I know a couple others have written on this, that in the de-identification process, if you have knowledge that that data can be reasonably re-identified, there is no safe harbor. You've shown that that can be done, and that basically, I can give people the reference to the website, but you either have to employ an expert who will certify through a scientific study, and I've mentioned this to some of the largest insurance companies, do you feel comfortable with the liability, how much of a bond they can carry for your liability in that route? The other route is you have to have no knowledge. You're showing there's knowledge, so I'm telling people there is no safe harbor in de-identification anymore, even under current law.
So what we like is the idea, what I like, I shouldn't speak for Jordan too much. I mean, we spoke so much over the last year. But one of the things it's kind of nice, computer science enjoyed an ability for technology to solve the same kind of problem in what we call now encryption. So when you use your credit card online and things like that, there are many things that we use strong encryption for. The way they got there was, at first, encryption schemes were ad hoc. It was what people thought was the right thing, what looked good, what you could kind of describe, as long as you didn't tell anyone, as long as there was some secrecy to it. And then someone would come along and they would break it, do the equivalent of what we've just done. And then some smarter people would come along and they'd say, here's a better way. And then somebody else would come along and they'd break it. And this cycle continued and continued until finally we got strong encryption. So I can tell you what I did and you still can't break it, right? And this is what the promise is and what can happen in data privacy as well. We can come up with these nice policy solutions, but they need an evolutionary process. And I worry that either I would feel that the wrong reaction to this work is to say privacy, we can't protect privacy, so either no data goes out or all the data flows, because I don't think that's where society is best served. I think society is best served by allowing these kinds of things to keep improving the standard. So we have a bar, that's something's wrong with that bar, we raise that standard. And this is how we raise it.
I think one of the concerns is we said we wanted an encryption standard. I fought for that encryption standard. We got it, and then we made it a safe harbor, because people just didn't want us to be told they absolutely had to do it. And you can read the press now, various large organizations saying, but we're not required to do it. So they left everything unencrypted, and under the breach notice, the way we set it up, if you encrypted your data, no foul. If you didn't lose your data, no foul. If you reported the breach to HHS, no penalty, no fine. They fought this for 4 years to get the final rule. We worked on that all through the stimulus. 4 years of fighting that for a rule that basically gave everyone a safe harbor and no penalty if they reported it. Now, to those who say that breach notice isn't powerful, it is powerful because they don't want to be on what they call the wall of shame. And that put pressure on them, but they fought it tooth and nail every step of the way. So,
Thank you.
it's essential. Thanks.
States are setting up the all-payer claims databases, and they're currently setting one up in Connecticut. And they're saying that they're going to release data. They're going to take all our health insurance claims data, put it in a centralized database along with our demographics, and then they're going to release the data according to federal standards for de-identification. If someone in a small state like Connecticut knows you, they can identify you right away with all the information that's going to be there, because it won't be just one hospital discharge, it'll be your whole life. So I was wondering if you could please comment on two things. One, how easy it is to re-identify data using the federal standards. They gave one 164.514B, and also the fact that the public really doesn't know about this, that all the states are setting this up where all their data is going to be in a centralized database run by a private company. And I presume they'll all follow the HIPAA laws, but there's breaches, there's hacking, not to mention people actually buying the de-identified data. So thanks.
I can take that one. It's interesting you asked the question, because one of the original reasons for the story came about was Latanya and I were talking about these state health information exchanges that are being set up under the stimulus and under Obamacare. And obviously there are a lot of benefits to having your medical record travel with you, of course. But one thing that was striking to me was the fact that these are private companies running these exchanges. And what happens there is, not only does that increase the risk of a hacking attack or whatever, it also gives me less leverage to figure out who they're selling to, who they're buying, who they're buying data from. And one of the best conversations I had with folks running those health information exchanges, was they said, right now we're working on stimulus money, we've gotten some subscription money, but eventually we're going to have to start selling this data. And that was originally the conversation that got Latanya and I going, on this project, which was, if these are private corporations that own the data, and again, we can see a lot of public good, for these exchanges, and if they're going to have to start selling data, who's to say that they're doing it in the right way? They are. My understanding is that they are going to be bound by HIPAA. They are business associates. They will follow the same rules that HIPAA has outlined. And I should say as well, one of the key takeaways for me from this project was an affirmation of the safe harbor standard, and that and of the HIPAA standard. So to the extent that more organizations follow that standard, and there's some empirical way to guarantee that that's what they're doing, that's really valuable. It's not necessarily a rewrite of the law. It's an affirmation of it. But once these health information exchanges really get going, and I've written a fair amount about this, some states, Indiana's one, have millions and millions of records. The way they're accumulating those records is not by asking explicitly. We've got folks on the record saying that. So once these exchanges really get moving, it's going to be very hard to know who they sell to. They're going to be private entities and not subject to public records requests. But this gives us a sense that there's still vulnerabilities out there. And it'll be harder to know where those exist once those exchanges get up and running. But it's going to be a key inflection point for health data privacy this coming year, and that was a key catalyst for our research as well.
One of the things I would say, and sort of to bring it back to the DataMap, is the goal of the DataMap is to make data sharing transparent. And I think that the call is even more so with health information exchanges and all-payer databases. If we see what's happening with the state hospital discharge databases, and now there are these other new ways that data are going to be available, I think it's very important to be able to find a way to make their data sharing transparent. Because this is the only way to really know what's going on.
Yeah. I think that kind of echoes my one of my main takeaways again was, that when working on a project like this, you're always trying to look to the end goal of well, what am I going to recommend? Is there something I can say or emphasize in the story, even if it's indirect, that is the potential solution? It became very clear here that states that are not the states are releasing data that's not to the HIPAA standard, it's probably in their benefit to do so. You know, most of these states also have licensing agreements so that if you want additional data, you sign away your life and you can get more data, you know, and you promise not to re-identify them. So those are probably good.
We're just going to end by just putting up the slide that has pointers. Can you go to the very last slide? Well, go back one. Well, that one, thanks. So the surveys, papers, and all that kind of stuff, you can get